December 17, 1944. The frost-covered fields of Belgium lay silent under a grey, suffocating sky. Snow fell in thick curtains, muffling the world in an eerie quiet that made every heartbeat sound like a drumbeat in the chest. But beneath that deceptive stillness, something monstrous was moving. The ground trembled. Trees shuddered. And in the distance, through the ghostly white veil of winter, came the unmistakable growl of German armor, deep, mechanical, hungry. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Hitler's last gamble. His final desperate thrust to split the Allied lines, recapture the port of Antwerp, and turn the tide of a war that was slipping through his fingers like sand. Over 200,000 German soldiers. Hundreds of tanks. Thousands of artillery pieces. All hurled into the Ardennes forest in a blitzkrieg that caught the Allies completely off guard. American positions crumbled. Radio chatter went silent. Men froze in their foxholes, not from the cold, but from the sheer terror of what was coming. And in the middle of this chaos, on a narrow dirt road cutting through the frozen Belgian countryside, stood a single Sherman tank. Alone. Its crew, 5 young Americans who'd barely seen their 20th birthdays, watched through their periscopes as shadows moved in the tree line. Shadows that grew larger. Darker. More menacing with every passing second. The radio inside the tank crackled with static and panic. Fall back. Fall back. All units retreat. But there was no retreat. Not for them. The road behind them was clogged with fleeing infantry, wounded soldiers dragging themselves through the snow, medics trying to save lives under fire. If that Sherman moved, if it abandoned its position, the German panzers would pour through that gap like a flood through a broken dam. So they stayed. The commander, a stocky kid from Ohio named Lieutenant Jim Harlow, pressed his face against the cold steel of the periscope and whispered a prayer he wasn't sure anyone was listening to. His gunner, Tommy Red Sullivan from Brooklyn, gripped the controls so tight his knuckles turned white. The driver, a farm boy named Eddie Kowalski, sat frozen in his seat, sweat pouring down his face despite the freezing temperature. The loader, Miguel Ramirez from Texas, kept his hands on a shell, ready to slam it into the breach the second the order came. And the assistant driver, barely 18 years old, a kid named Billy Harper from Kansas, just stared at the trees and tried not to think about his mother's last letter still folded in his pocket. Then they saw it. A German Tiger tank. 60 tons of rolling death. Its massive 88mm gun pointed straight at them like the eye of God. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the fog. Panzer IVs. Panthers. Half-tracks loaded with infantry. An entire mechanized column bearing down on their position. And from somewhere in that steel horde, laughter echoed across the snow. German soldiers, confident and cocky, seeing that lone Sherman sitting there like a lamb waiting for slaughter. They laughed because they knew. Everyone knew. A Sherman couldn't take a Tiger in a straight fight. The armor was too thin. The gun too weak. American tankers had a grim joke about it, 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger. It took 5 Allied tanks, attacking from multiple angles, to have a chance at knocking out a single German heavy. And here was just one. One lonely, outdated, outgunned Sherman sitting in the middle of the road like it had a death wish. The Germans laughed. But they didn't know what was hiding in the woods behind that Sherman. Lieutenant Harlow keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his throat. All Phantom units, this is Phantom lead. Hold your fire. Let them get close. Let them think they've won. Static. Then, one by one, 4 voices crackled back. Phantom 2, ready. Phantom 3, locked and loaded. Phantom 4, we got your back, Lieutenant. Phantom 5, let's send these bastards to hell. 4 more Shermans. Hidden. Camouflaged in the dense forest on either side of the road, their engines silenced, their crews holding their breath. The Germans couldn't see them. They were so focused on that one helpless Sherman in the middle of the road, so confident in their superior firepower, that they walked straight into the trap. The Tiger commander, a grizzled veteran who'd fought in Russia and France, stood in his cupola and raised his hand, signaling his column to halt. He wanted to savor this. Wanted to watch that American tank burn. Wanted his men to see what happened to those who dared stand against the Wehrmacht. He lowered his hand, and his gunner lined up the shot. Inside the Sherman, Red Sullivan watched the Tiger's barrel swing toward them. Jim, they're gonna fire. Hold. Jim. Hold. The Tiger's gun flashed. The world exploded in sound and fury. The shell screamed through the air, a supersonic lance of death that missed the Sherman by less than 3 feet and slammed into the frozen earth behind it, erupting in a geyser of dirt and snow. The concussion rocked the tank, throwing the crew against the walls. Billy Harper screamed. Miguel Ramirez cursed in Spanish. Eddie Kowalski nearly threw up. But Lieutenant Harlow didn't flinch. Now. 4 muzzle flashes lit up the forest like lightning. 4 75mm shells, fired in perfect synchronization, converged on the German column from 3 different angles. The first shell struck a Panzer IV broadside, punching through its thinner armor and detonating the ammunition inside. The tank exploded like a Roman candle, turret flying 30 feet into the air, flames vomiting from every hatch. The second shell hit a half-track, shredding it into scrap metal and body parts. The third clipped a Panther's tracks, immobilizing it instantly. The fourth slammed into the Tiger's side armor, the only place where a Sherman had a prayer of penetrating, and something inside caught fire. The German laughter died. Replaced by screams. Panic erupted in the German ranks. Soldiers bailed from their vehicles, scrambling for cover as more shells rained down. The Shermans, no longer hiding, roared out of the tree line like vengeful ghosts, engines howling, tracks chewing through the snow, guns firing as fast as their loaders could work. It was chaos. Pure, unfiltered, brutal chaos. Tanks exploded. Infantry scattered. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The entire carefully organized German column disintegrated into a confused, bleeding mass of metal and men. And in the middle of it all, Lieutenant Harlow's Sherman charged straight at the Tiger. Red, load armor piercing. Eddie, full throttle. Miguel, get ready to reload faster than you've ever reloaded in your life. We're gonna ram a Tiger. Eddie screamed. Just drive. The Sherman surged forward, track spraying snow, engine screaming in protest. The Tiger, wounded but not dead, tried to rotate its turret, tried to bring that massive gun to bear, but it was too slow, too cumbersome, and the Sherman was too close, too fast. Red Sullivan fired point-blank into the Tiger's rear deck, the weakest point on any tank, and the shell punched through like a hot knife through butter, detonating the fuel tanks. The Tiger burned. And the German division, confident just minutes ago, was dying. But this story, this impossible, brutal, beautiful story, was just beginning. 30 minutes earlier, the war had been going very differently. The Allied command was in full retreat mode. Reports flooded in from every sector. Germans breaking through lines, entire battalions surrounded, roads choked with fleeing soldiers. The Ardennes offensive had achieved complete surprise, and now the Wehrmacht was doing what it did best, exploiting that surprise with ruthless efficiency. Generals scrambled to reorganize defenses. Reinforcements were rushed forward. Air support was grounded by the weather. It was a disaster unfolding in real time, and nobody knew how to stop it. Except for one man. Colonel Marcus Trent, a battle-hardened armor commander who'd fought from North Africa to Normandy, stood in a freezing command tent staring at a map covered in red enemy markers. His staff officers hovered around him, faces pale, voices shaking as they delivered one piece of bad news after another. Sir, the 28th Division is falling back. Sir, we've lost contact with the 106th. Sir, German tanks are within 5 miles of the fuel depot. Trent silenced them with a raised hand. He wasn't panicking. He was thinking. Decades of experience, countless battles, every lesson learned the hard way in blood and fire, all of it crystallized in that moment as he studied the map. His finger traced a narrow road cutting through the forest. A choke point. A place where terrain narrowed, where trees pressed in close, where a small force could hold off a much larger one. If they had the guts to stay. Get me Phantom Company, Trent said quietly. His officers exchanged glances. Phantom Company was a tank unit, but not a famous one. Not a storied regiment with a proud history. Just 5 Shermans and their crews, veterans who'd seen enough combat to know how to survive but not enough glory to make the history books. They were solid. Reliable. But unremarkable. Until today. Lieutenant Jim Harlow received the order on his radio while his Sherman idled in a snow-covered clearing. His crew was exhausted. They'd been fighting for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, living on cold rations and colder coffee. When Trent's voice crackled through the static, explaining the mission, Harlow felt his stomach drop. You want us to hold that road? Sir, intelligence says there's an entire panzer division heading our way. I know what intelligence says, Lieutenant. With respect, sir, 5 Shermans can't stop a division. Colonel Trent's voice was calm. Almost gentle. 5 Shermans can't fight a division head-on. But 5 Shermans with smart commanders, good positions, and a little luck? They can break one. You taught at the armor school before the war, didn't you, Harlow? Yes, sir. Tactics and then use those tactics. Use the terrain. Use their arrogance against them. Make them think you're weaker than you are. Make them underestimate you. And if we fail? A pause. Then, softer, then thousands of men behind you die, and the Germans push all the way to Antwerp. So don't fail. The radio clicked off. Harlow sat in his commander's seat, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of the entire war pressing down on his shoulders. Red Sullivan looked back at him from the gunner's position. So? What's the plan, Lieutenant? Harlow took a deep breath. We're going to kill a dragon. Within the hour, Phantom Company was in position. Harlow placed his tank in the center of the road, the bait. The other 4 Shermans were hidden in the forest, carefully camouflaged with branches and snow. Their crews cut their engines and waited in the freezing cold, breath fogging the air inside their tanks, fingers numb on the controls. They could hear the Germans coming long before they saw them. The rumble of heavy armor. The clank of treads. The guttural shouts of officers organizing their columns. Inside Phantom 2, Sergeant Bill Anderson, a grizzled career soldier with a face like weathered leather, whispered to his crew, "Remember boys, don't fire until Harlow gives the word. We get one shot at this ambush." 1. Inside Phantom 3, a young lieutenant fresh from the States named Danny Pierce tried to keep his voice from shaking as he told his gunner, "Aim for tracks first. Mobility kills. Bring them to a stop, then finish them." Inside Phantom 4, the crew said nothing. They were veterans of Sicily and Normandy. They didn't need pep talks. They just loaded their shells and waited. Inside Phantom 5, the youngest crew in the company, none older than 21, held hands in the cramped interior of their tank and prayed together. Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, it didn't matter. They prayed to whatever God would listen. And then the Germans arrived. The Tiger led the column, flanked by Panthers and Panzer IVs. Behind them, half-tracks loaded with infantry. Supply trucks. Self-propelled guns. It was a mechanized nightmare, a rolling fortress of steel and fire. And when they saw that lone Sherman sitting in the middle of the road, engines running, turret pointing straight at them, they laughed. The German tank commander, Hauptmann Klaus von Richtmann, a decorated officer with an iron cross pinned to his tunic, actually stood up in his cupola to get a better look. He called out to his men in German, something about American foolishness, and the soldiers laughed with him. They'd seen so many Shermans burn. So many American crews die screaming inside their steel coffins. This would be no different. Von Richtmann gave the order to fire. But fate, that fickle mistress of war, had other plans. The Tiger's first shot missed, a mechanical glitch, a slight miscalculation, a gust of wind, who knows. But it missed. And in that split second, when the German commander realized his prey was still alive, when his brain was still processing the impossibility of that miss, Lieutenant Harlow sprang the trap. 4 Shermans. 4 kill shots. 4 German vehicles exploding in the span of heartbeats. The ambush was perfect. The Germans, so confident moments before, were now dying. But the battle was far from over. Because a wounded animal is the most dangerous kind, the German column didn't collapse. Not immediately. These were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who'd fought in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, who'd survived the meat grinder of Kursk. They'd been ambushed before. They'd seen friends die before. And they knew how to fight back. Hauptmann von Richtmann, standing in his burning Tiger, screamed orders even as flames licked at his boots. He leaped from the cupola just before the ammunition cooked off, hit the snow running, and rallied his scattered troops. Infantry, into the trees. Panzers, suppressing fire. Mortars, range 200 meters, carpet the forest. The German machine guns opened up, raking the tree line where the Shermans were hiding. Mortar shells began falling, exploding in the branches above, showering the American tanks with deadly shrapnel. A fragment punched through Phantom 3's open hatch, striking Lieutenant Danny Pierce in the shoulder. He screamed, blood spraying across the interior, but his gunner didn't stop firing. The Panthers, more mobile than the Tiger, began flanking maneuvers. 2 swung wide to the left, trying to get behind the American position. Another charged straight up the road, firing on the move, shells slamming into the trees, splintering trunks, setting the forest ablaze. Phantom 2 took a direct hit, not penetrating, but the concussion knocked out their radio and deafened the driver. They fought on in silence, isolated, blind to the larger battle. Inside Phantom lead, Lieutenant Harlow was making split-second decisions that would determine whether his men lived or died. Eddie, reverse 20 meters. Red, track that Panther on the left, the one flanking. Miguel, load high explosive, we've got infantry in the open. The Sherman lurched backward, tracks spinning, throwing up rooster tails of snow. Red Sullivan tracked the Panther through his sights, leading the target, compensating for movement, for wind, for the slight tilt of the ground. He whispered a prayer his mother taught him, Hail Mary, full of grace, and squeezed the trigger. The shell flew true. It struck the Panther's turret ring, that thin weak point where the turret met the hull, and jammed the traverse mechanism. The German tank couldn't rotate its gun anymore. It was effectively blind. Red didn't give them time to bail out. He fired again. And again. 3 shells, 3 hits, and the Panther was a burning wreck. But the cost was mounting. Phantom 5, manned by that young crew who'd prayed together, took a mortar round directly on the engine deck. The explosion blew off the back of the tank, killed the driver instantly, and set the fuel on fire. The surviving crew bailed out into a storm of machine gun fire. 3 of them made it to cover. 2 didn't. Sergeant Anderson in Phantom 2, fighting deaf and alone, rolled his Sherman out of the tree line and charged straight at a German half-track, crushing it under his tracks, grinding it into the frozen earth along with the screaming soldiers inside. Then he spun his tank around and rammed a supply truck, scattering ammunition and supplies across the snow before backing away, his armor riddled with bullet holes but still fighting. Lieutenant Harlow saw it all happening in fragments, smoke, explosions, traces cutting through the air like lethal fireflies. His training told him this was chaos, that the battle was slipping out of control. But his instincts told him something different. They were winning. The Germans were reacting, not attacking. They were scrambling, not advancing. The ambush had worked. Now they just had to survive the counterattack. All Phantom units, focus fire on the Panthers. Take out their heavies first. Phantom 3, despite their wounded commander, knocked out a Panzer IV that was trying to flank their position. Phantom 4, the silent veterans, methodically eliminated 2 half-tracks and a self-propelled gun. And Phantom 2, still deaf, still isolated, somehow managed to destroy another Panther by ramming it from behind and firing point-blank into its engine. But Hauptmann von Richtmann wasn't finished. He'd commandeered a functional Panther, climbed into the commander's seat, and now he was hunting. Hunting for that lead Sherman. The one that started all this. He could see it through the smoke, that American tank that had the audacity to challenge the Wehrmacht. Von Richtmann was a killer. He'd destroyed 17 Allied tanks in his career. He wasn't going to let an American farm boy in a Sherman be number 18. He positioned his Panther on a slight rise, hull down, only the turret exposed. Perfect firing position. He ordered his gunner to lock onto Harlow's tank. Range, 400 meters. Target moving. Compensating for speed, for wind, for the slight downward angle. Fire. The shell screamed across the battlefield. Inside Phantom lead, Billy Harper, the assistant driver, saw it coming. Some sixth sense, some premonition of death, made him look up at exactly the wrong moment. He saw the shell in mid-flight, saw it arcing toward them, and he screamed, "Incoming!" Lieutenant Harlow threw the tank into a hard right turn. Eddie Kowalski reacted on pure instinct, jerking the controls, and the Sherman lurched sideways just as the shell arrived. Instead of hitting the front armor and punching straight through, the shell glanced off the sloped glacis plate, ricocheting upward, and exploded in the air 10 feet above them. Shrapnel rained down. The tank's radio antenna was sheared off. The periscope shattered. But they were alive. Where did that come from? Red Sullivan shouted. Harlow, blood running from a cut on his forehead, wiped his eyes and spotted the Panther on the rise. He recognized a good firing position when he saw one. Whoever was commanding that tank knew what they were doing. This wasn't just another German tanker. This was a hunter. Red, you see him? Got him. Can you make the shot? Red Sullivan, the kid from Brooklyn who'd dropped out of high school to enlist, who'd never been the smartest or the strongest but who had a gift for seeing trajectories, for understanding angles, for knowing where a shell would go before he fired it. Red stared through his damaged sight and calculated. Range, 400 meters. Target hull down. Minimal profile. Bad angle. Worse odds. Yeah, he said quietly. I can make it. Then make it. Time slowed. Red Sullivan steadied his breathing. Cleared his mind. Thought about his mother in Brooklyn, his kid sister, his old man who'd worked the docks. Thought about every lesson he'd learned in gunnery school, every training exercise, every battle before this one. All of it, his whole life, his whole purpose, came down to this single moment, this single shot. He fired. The shell left the barrel at 2,000 feet per second. It flew across the snow-covered battlefield, wobbling slightly in the wind, dropping gradually from gravity, and struck Hauptmann von Richtmann's Panther exactly where Red Sullivan meant it to, the base of the gun barrel, where the armor was thinnest, where the mantlet joined the turret. The shell punched through and detonated inside. The Panther exploded from within, turret lifting off its mounting ring, flames roaring from every opening. Hauptmann von Richtmann, the hunter who'd survived Stalingrad and Kursk, didn't survive Belgium. And with his death, the German attack crumbled. The German division was breaking. Not retreating in good order. Not conducting a tactical withdrawal. Breaking. Vehicles abandoned. Officers dead or missing. Soldiers fleeing into the forest with no clear orders, no leadership, no hope. What had been a confident mechanized column 30 minutes ago was now a scattered, bleeding mob of survivors trying desperately to escape the killing ground. But Lieutenant Harlow didn't know that yet. From inside his damaged Sherman, with the periscope shattered and the radio dead, he could only see fragments of the battle. Burning tanks. Running soldiers. Smoke so thick it turned day into twilight. For all he knew, there were more Germans coming. Reinforcements. Heavy armor. He couldn't risk assuming victory when defeat might be hiding in the fog. Red, you still with me? Yeah, Jim, I'm here. Eddie, can you move us? Engines running hot, but yeah, we can move. Miguel, how's our ammo? 7 shells left. 4 armor-piercing, 3 high-explosive. 7 shells. That's all they had left between survival and death. Harlow made a decision, the same decision he'd been making all day, the decision that defined him as a commander. They wouldn't retreat until they were sure the road was held. Phantom units, this is lead. Anyone still operational, sound off. Silence. Static. Then, crackling through the broken radio, Phantom 2 here, deaf as a doorknob but still kicking. Phantom 3. Pierce is hit but we're still in the fight. Phantom 4, we're dry on AP rounds but we've got machine gun ammo for days. Phantom 5 didn't respond. They never would again. 4 tanks. Out of 5. 4 battered, damaged, nearly empty Shermans against an entire German division. And then, through the smoke, Lieutenant Harlow saw them. More German tanks. At least 6 Panthers and a dozen Panzer IVs, forming up at the far end of the road, preparing for one final coordinated assault. They'd pulled back, regrouped, and now they were coming with everything they had left. No more confidence. No more arrogance. Just cold, murderous determination to break through this American roadblock and continue their offensive. This was it. The climax. The moment where everything would be decided. Harlow keyed his radio one last time. All units, listen to me. We don't have the ammo for a sustained fight. We don't have the armor to take them head-on. But we have position. We have cover. And we have the fact that they are scared now. They thought this would be easy. We taught them different. Now we're going to teach them one more lesson. What lesson is that, Lieutenant? Sergeant Anderson asked, his voice hollow and distant in his deafened ears. That Americans don't quit. The German tanks began their advance. Slow at first. Methodical. Covering each other, suppressing the tree line with machine gun fire, lobbing high-explosive shells into the forest to keep the American tanks pinned down. It was textbook armor tactics. Exactly what Harlow would have taught at the armor school. Exactly what would work against a weaker, demoralized enemy. But Phantom Company wasn't demoralized. They were pissed off. Phantom 4, the silent veterans, rolled out from behind a burning half-track and opened fire with every machine gun they had. Traces lit up the twilight, raking across the German infantry following the tanks, cutting them down in swaths. The Germans scattered, losing their coordination, and in that moment of confusion, Phantom 2 charged. Sergeant Anderson, still deaf, still isolated, drove his Sherman straight at the German line like a medieval knight at a joust. He couldn't hear his crew screaming at him to stop. Couldn't hear the shells bouncing off his armor. Couldn't hear anything except the roar of his own engine and his own heartbeat. He crashed into a Panzer IV at full speed, the collision throwing both crews around inside their tanks, and then he fired point-blank into the German tank's side armor. The Panzer exploded. Anderson backed up, spun his tank around, and did it again to another Panzer IV. Ramming. Firing. Ramming. It was insane. It was reckless. It was working. Phantom 3, with Lieutenant Pierce bleeding in the commander's seat, took up an overwatch position and began systematically picking off German tanks as they tried to react to Anderson's mad charge. 1 shot. 1 kill. 1 shot. 1 kill. Pace's gunner was a kid from Montana who'd grown up hunting elk in the mountains. He knew how to lead a moving target. He knew how to make every shot count. And he did. And Lieutenant Harlow, in phantom lead, saw the opening he'd been waiting for. The German formation had collapsed into chaos, reacting to Anderson's charge, trying to stop the bleeding. Their line was broken. Their coordination shattered. And there, exposed on the left flank, was the command tank. Harlow could tell by the extra antennas, by the way other tanks were oriented toward it, by some indefinable instinct that came from years of studying armor warfare. Red, command tank, 11 o'clock, 600 meters. I see him. Kill him. Red Sullivan, exhausted, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, half-blind from smoke and concussion, lined up his shot. He didn't have time to calculate ballistics. Didn't have time to compensate for wind or range or the slight tremor in his hands. He just aimed at the center of mass and fired. The shell flew. It hit the command tank in the turret ring, pure luck, divine intervention, fate, whatever you want to call it, and the tank brewed up instantly, ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction that tore the vehicle apart from the inside. The German attack collapsed. Officers dead. Communications cut. No leadership. No orders. The remaining tanks stopped advancing, crews bailing out, soldiers throwing down their weapons. Some tried to run. Some tried to surrender. Some just sat in the snow and stared at nothing, broken by the sheer impossibility of what had just happened to them. An entire German division, over 200 armored vehicles, thousands of soldiers, shattered by 5 American tanks. No, not 5. 4. 4 battered Shermans and the men inside them who refused to die. Lieutenant Harlow sat in his commander's seat, hands shaking, breath coming in ragged gasps, and whispered, "Cease fire. Cease fire. It's over." But the war wasn't over. Not yet. The snow kept falling. Long after the guns fell silent, long after the fires burned down to embers, long after the medics arrived to tend the wounded and collect the dead, the snow kept falling. Soft and gentle, covering the scars of battle like a white shroud, hiding the blood and the bodies and the broken machines beneath a blanket of winter purity. Lieutenant Jim Harlow stood outside his Sherman, staring at the wreckage scattered across the road. Dozens of destroyed German vehicles. Hundreds of captured soldiers, hands raised, eyes hollow, marching back toward POW camps. And in the tree line, barely visible through the drifting snow, 4 Sherman tanks, beaten, scarred, bleeding oil and coolant, but still standing. Colonel Trent arrived an hour after the battle ended. He climbed out of his jeep, surveyed the carnage, and walked slowly toward Harlow. The lieutenant snapped a salute. Trent returned it, then did something unexpected. He extended his hand. "Lieutenant, I'm not sure whether to court-martial you for disobeying common sense or recommend you for the Medal of Honor." Harlow's laugh was hollow. "We just did what we were trained to do, sir." "No." Trent's grip tightened. "You did something nobody else would have dared. Intelligence is confirming it now. This wasn't just any German unit. This was the 11th Panzer Division. Elite. Veteran. They were the tip of the spear for the entire Bulge offensive. If they'd broken through here, they would have reached the fuel depot by nightfall and trapped 3 entire American divisions behind enemy lines. You didn't just win a battle, Lieutenant. You saved thousands of lives." Harlow looked back at his tank, at Red Sullivan sitting on the turret with his head in his hands, at Eddie Kowalski being helped out by medics, at Miguel Ramirez kneeling in the snow beside the wreckage of Phantom 5, at Billy Harper staring at nothing. "We lost good men, sir." "I know. Phantom 5, they were just kids. They died heroes. And because they died, thousands of other kids get to live." It was true, but it didn't make it hurt any less. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month. The Germans would be pushed back, defeated, broken. The war would end in Allied victory. But the cost, the terrible, incalculable cost, would echo through history forever. 19,000 Americans killed. Over 80,000 casualties. Entire towns destroyed. Families shattered. Lives ended before they truly began. But here, on this frozen Belgian road, 5 Sherman tanks had held the line. 4 survived. 1 didn't. And together, they proved something that the German High Command never understood, something that no amount of superior firepower or advanced technology could overcome. That courage isn't about having the best weapons. It's about refusing to quit when every rational thought tells you to run. In the days that followed, reporters arrived to interview the crews of Phantom Company. They wanted dramatic quotes, heroic sound bites, something to feed the folks back home hungry for good news. But the men of Phantom Company didn't have much to say. They were just tired. Bone tired. Soul tired. Red Sullivan, when asked how he felt about destroying so many enemy tanks, just shrugged. I was too scared to think about feelings. I just did my job. Sergeant Anderson, his hearing slowly returning, was asked if he'd been afraid during his mad charge into the German lines. He thought about it for a long moment, then said, I was terrified. But I was more afraid of letting my brothers down. Lieutenant Danny Pierce, recovering from his shoulder wound, told a reporter, people keep calling us heroes. But the real heroes are the guys in Phantom 5. They didn't make it home. We did. Remember them, not us. And Lieutenant Jim Harlow, when asked what he'd learned from the battle, stared at the snow-covered road and said quietly, I learned that war doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't care about odds. It only cares about who's willing to stand when everyone else runs. We stood. And somehow, by the grace of God or luck or whatever you want to call it, we're still here to talk about it. The Sherman tanks of Phantom Company were repaired and sent back into action. They fought through Belgium, into Germany, all the way to the Elbe River where they met the Soviet forces pushing from the east. They survived the war. Most of their crews survived too, though they carried scars, physical and mental, that would never fully heal. After the war, the men went home. Red Sullivan returned to Brooklyn and became a mechanic. Eddie Kowalski went back to his family farm in Nebraska. Miguel Ramirez settled in Texas and started a construction company. Billy Harper enrolled in college on the GI Bill, became a teacher, and never spoke about the war except once a year, on the anniversary of the battle, when he'd visit the families of the boys from Phantom 5. Lieutenant Jim Harlow stayed in the Army. He rose to the rank of colonel, taught at the Armor School for 20 years, and trained a new generation of tank commanders. He never forgot the lessons learned on that frozen Belgian road. Never forgot that courage isn't something you're born with, it's something you choose, moment by moment, when fear tries to break you. And Sergeant Bill Anderson, the deaf warrior who charged the German line like a madman? He received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration. But he never wore it. He kept it in a drawer, wrapped in cloth, because he said it belonged to all of them, every man who fought that day, living and dead. The Battle of the Bulge became one of the most famous engagements of World War II. History books remember the massive scale, the desperate fighting, the eventual Allied victory. But buried in the footnotes, in the after-action reports filed away in archives, is the story of Phantom Company. 5 Shermans. 4 survivors. 30 minutes that changed the course of a battle, and maybe, in some small way, changed the course of the war. The German soldiers who laughed at that lone Sherman on the road learned a lesson that day. A lesson written in fire and blood and twisted metal. They learned that you should never underestimate your enemy. Never assume victory before the battle is won. And never, ever laugh at a Sherman tank, because you might not live long enough to regret it. 7 to 9 years have passed since that December day in Belgium. The men of Phantom Company are gone now, claimed by time if not by war. Their tanks rest in museums, silent sentinels of a different age. The snow still falls in the Ardennes, covering the ground where they fought, where they bled, where they proved that sometimes, against all odds, the few can stand against the many and prevail. Their story is a reminder. A reminder that heroism isn't always loud and celebrated. Sometimes it's quiet men in cold tanks, terrified and exhausted, choosing to stay when every instinct screams to flee. Sometimes it's a gunner from Brooklyn making an impossible shot. A driver from Nebraska executing a desperate maneuver. A loader from Texas keeping the shells coming no matter what. An assistant driver from Kansas holding his fear inside so his brothers don't lose hope. Sometimes, heroism is just refusing to quit. And in that refusal, in that stubborn, bloody-minded determination to hold the line no matter the cost, we find the true spirit that won the war. Not superior technology. Not overwhelming numbers. But men who looked at impossible odds, laughed in the face of death, and said, not today. You don't get through. Not while we're still breathing. That's the legacy of Phantom Company. That's the story of 5 Sherman tanks that destroyed a division. That's why we remember. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next video.